Usually when we talk about medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like absolute precision. It's almost like engineering.
Right. Yeah, like measuring something physical.
Exactly. Like if you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. There's the problem.
It's binary. It's visible. I mean, it's either broken or not broken, and the treatment plan is mapped directly to that visible physical evidence.
And that is incredibly comforting. I mean, we like things to be visible. We like them neatly categorized. But then you step into the world of human personality, into the architecture of the mind, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, entirely useless. Yeah.
Right. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely invisible. We are trying to map the hidden operating system of human behavior. And to do that with you today, we're going to explore the foundational blueprint created by psychology's most famous and, well, definitely most misunderstood pioneer.
Sigmund Freud.
Sigmund Freud.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And frankly, the historical context surrounding Freud makes those waters even murkier.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're going to structure things a little differently. I'm officially taking a seat in the student's chair, and I'm handing you the lecturer's pointer. My job is to ask the questions, and your job as the lecturer is to guide both me and you, listening right now, through this dense material without us getting, lost in the weeds.
I will gladly take on the lecture role for this one.
Awesome. We are pulling all of this from section 11.2 of chapter 11 from Psychology 2E, by the way.
Perfect. And honestly, it's a really important dynamic to have here, the student-lecturer thing, because the material in section 11.2 requires us to unlearn a lot of pop culture myths before we can actually understand the psychology.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we even touch on the famous theories like the iceberg, the Oedipus complex, all of that, we have to talk about who Freud actually was. Because I think most of us, when we hear the name Freud, we instantly picture a modern psychologist sitting in a chair with a notepad.
Right, but that's a massive anachronism.
Yeah.
I mean, when Freud was receiving his education in the late 19th century, there was no such thing as a degree in psychology. The field literally didn't exist in the way we know it today.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was a medical doctor, specifically a Viennese neurologist and physician. And grasping that is just, well, it's crucial to understanding everything he did. He didn't approach the mind as a philosopher. He approached it as a doctor trying to cure severe physical ailments that, bafflingly, had zero physical cause.
And that medical mystery leads us straight to the 1880s, and a woman the textbook refers to by the pseudonym Anna O. She is essentially patient zero for psychoanalysis, even though Freud wasn't even her primary doctor.
Right, he wasn't.
Which is wild. But Anna O had been caring for her dying father, which was obviously an incredibly stressful, deeply traumatic period. And she started experiencing these terrifying physical symptoms. We're talking partial paralysis, blurred vision, headaches, hallucinations, and even amnesia.
And if you're a doctor in the 1880s looking at a patient with a paralyzed arm, but the nerves and muscles in that arm are perfectly healthy.
You're just totally stuck.
Entirely stuck. The medical establishment at the time slapped a very dismissive catch-all label on this, which was hysteria.
Right. It was basically the Victorian medical term for, like, we have no idea why this woman is suffering.
Exactly.
Now, Freud's colleague, a physician named Joseph Breuer, treated Anna O for about 2 years. And Breuer made what I consider to be one of the most significant accidental discoveries in medical history. He found that when he just allowed Anna O to talk openly about her experiences, her physical symptoms, the paralysis, the hallucinations, actually began to subside.
It was revolutionary. I mean, it was Anna O herself who coined the term the talking cure.
That's such a great phrase.
It really is. The idea that a cognitive intervention, simply speaking, could resolve a physical symptom fundamentally shifted how we view the mind-body connection. They were so fascinated by this that Freud and Breuer actually co-authored a book in 1895 called Studies on Hysteria.
But okay, as the student here looking at the source material, I have to point out a wild caveat in the textbook. It explicitly states that Freud never actually met Anna O.
He didn't.
So how does a medical doctor build the entire foundation of a personality theory based on a patient he never personally interacted with?
That is the pivotal question. You're right, Freud never treated her. What he did was synthesize Breuer's extensive clinical notes. But Freud's genius and, well, his controversy lay in his ability to extrapolate a grand mechanism from those notes.
Okay, so he's looking at the bigger picture.
Right. Breuer saw that talking helped. Freud asked why talking helped. Freud concluded that Anna O's hysteria was the physical manifestation of highly traumatic experiences, specifically, he theorized, sexual abuse in early childhood that had been entirely hidden from her conscious awareness.
So the trauma was walled off.
Mm.
Her brain basically hid the memories to protect her, but the pressure of holding those memories down leaked out as physical paralysis.
Exactly. And that specific conclusion, that childhood sexual trauma was the root cause, was actually where Breuer drew the line. Breuer completely disagreed, and it actually ended their working relationship.
Oh, wow. Really?
Yeah, the split over it. But Freud doubled down. He theorized that if a hidden memory possesses enough power to literally paralyze a human arm, then there must be an entirely hidden realm of the mind. And that was the birth of the systematic theory of the unconscious.
Which brings us to the most famous metaphor in all of psychology, and one that most of you listening are probably somewhat familiar with, which is the iceberg.
Yes, the classic iceberg.
Right. Freud argued that the mind is structured exactly like an iceberg. The tiny fraction of ice visible above the water is our conscious mind. But beneath the surface, driving the entire mass, is the unconscious making up about 90% of our mental activity.
And, the physics of an iceberg make it a terrifyingly apt metaphor, because what's underwater isn't just dormant, it's active, it's immense, and it literally dictates where the iceberg floats.
Yeah, steering the ship.
Exactly. Freud argued that this underwater region is a repository for unacceptable urges, aggressive instincts, and repressed trauma. And within this hidden space, there is a constant, brutal turf war happening between three interacting systems of our personality.
Right, the id, the ego, and the superego. Now, most people know these terms from pop culture, but the textbook really digs into the mechanics of this internal war.
It does.
The id is entirely unconscious, deep underwater. It's the primal engine, present from birth, driven purely by the pleasure principle. It wants immediate gratification for hunger, thirst, sex, and aggression.
Yeah.
It just doesn't care about society or consequences at all.
Then, in stark opposition to that, you have the superego. This develops later as we internalize societal rules, parental guidance, cultural norms. It's our hyper-strict moral compass.
The inner critic.
Yeah, exactly. It operates on the principle of perfection, judging our actions and causing immense pride when we do well, but absolutely crushing, debilitating guilt when we fall short.
Okay, so if I can throw an analogy at you from the student desk to see if I'm tracking the mechanics of this.
Go for it.
Is the ego basically a highly stressed out parent trying to physically stop a toddler, the edo, from eating dirt or running into traffic, all while a deeply judgmental grandparent, the superego, stands over their shoulder criticizing every single parenting decision?
That is an incredibly useful way to look at it. And if we take that further, you start to see why human beings are so anxious all the time.
Right.
The ego is the rational part of the mind. It operates on the reality principle. Its only job is to negotiate a compromise between the screaming toddler and the judgmental grandparent while still functioning in the real world. Freud argued that a healthy personality requires a very strong ego, a highly capable parent, in your analogy.
Because if the balance fails, the personality fractures, right? Right. Like if the id is too dominant, you get extreme narcissism and dangerous impulsivity. If the superego is dominant, you get someone paralyzed by neurotic guilt, denying themselves even basic joys. And if the superego just never develops at all, you're potentially looking at psychopathy.
Precisely. And this constant, exhausting pressure on the ego is where Freud thought a lot of our daily quirks came from.
Speaking of quirks, and the id trying to break through the surface, section 11.2 brings up Freudian slips. Use that term all the time when someone accidentally says the wrong word. Freud believed this was the id literally slipping past the ego's defenses, right? That speech errors were hidden aggressive or sexual urges leaking out.
That was a theory, yeah.
But the textbook points out that modern science really pushes back on this.
It definitely does. While Freud saw every slip of the tongue as a deeply meaningful window into the unconscious, modern linguists have dismantled a lot of that. Researchers like Michael Motley have shown that these speech errors are typically just cognitive misfires.
Just our brains glitching.
Yeah, they happen because we're sleep-deprived or anxious, or our brain is just trying to process too many similar-sounding words at once. The modern consensus leans heavily toward structural language errors rather than, hidden desires.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Let's go back to our stressed-out parent, the ego. The textbook explains that when the ego is losing the battle, when the toddler is screaming too loudly and the grandparent is piling on too much guilt, we experience unbearable anxiety. And to survive that anxiety, The ego unconsciously deploys what I like to think of as mental bodyguards.
I love that term for them. The textbook refers to these as defense mechanisms.
Yeah.
And the vital thing to understand here is that they are entirely unconscious. You don't choose to use them.
Makes automatic.
Completely automatic. When reality becomes too painful or threatening, your ego distorts or falsifies that reality to protect you from a psychological collapse.
And the textbook groups these mechanisms in really fascinating ways. Let's look at the strategies of peer avoidance. The most foundational is repression. This isn't just forgetting where you put your keys. This is the mind literally burying a traumatic event so deep it's inaccessible. There's an example in the book of a woman named Lucia who cannot remember her grandfather's fatal heart attack, even though she was in the room when it happened.
Yeah, and the textbook provides a brilliant mechanical analogy for repression. Imagine you're driving and your car engine starts making a horrific grinding noise. You know fixing it will bankrupt you. The anxiety of that reality is just too much.
So what do you do?
Right, instead of going to a mechanic, you just crank up the radio until you can't hear the engine anymore. And eventually, you literally forget the car is broken. That's repression. It works in the short term, but eventually, the engine blows.
Wow, yeah. Then you have another avoiding strategy, regression. This is retreating to a much earlier, safer stage of psychological development. Like the example of Giorgio, who fails his doctoral exams and reacts by spending 3 days in bed cuddling a childhood stuffed animal.
Right, the reality of adult failure is too harsh, so the ego regresses to a time when someone else solved all the problems.
But then we get into the distortion and projection strategies, which are arguably a lot more complex. Like, look at reaction formation. This occurs when the ego deals with an unacceptable, unconscious urge by forcing the person to act out the exact opposite behavior.
This one is super interesting.
It is. The textbook's example of this is Joe, a high school student. Unconsciously, Joe is attracted to males. But consciously, he is terrified that if he's gay, his family will disown him and his peers will mock him. The collision of his internal truth and his external fear creates massive anxiety.
So his ego deploys reaction formation.
Exactly. Joe adopts an ultra-macho persona, aggressively makes homophobic jokes, and actively bullies a gay classmate. By fiercely projecting the opposite of his reality, his ego builds a wall to keep his actual desires hidden.
It's a tragic but incredibly effective distortion. The ego basically calculates that becoming a bully is psychologically safer than confronting the internal truth. And closely related to that is projection, where you take your own unacceptable impulses and attribute them to someone else.
Like Chris, who is chronically unfaithful to her boyfriend, the guilt, the superego is screaming at her. To silence it, she projects her behavior onto him, constantly accusing him of cheating. It shifts the anxiety outward.
We also see redirection strategies like displacement, where you transfer your anger from a threatening target to a safe one. Like you get yelled at by your boss, but instead of yelling back and getting fired, you go home and scream at your dog.
Poor dog.
Yeah, exactly. And finally, sublimation, which Freud actually viewed as a healthy defense mechanism. This is channeling unacceptable urges into socially productive activities.
Like the example of Jerome, who loses a child to a drunk driver. Instead of acting on his entirely understandable urge for violent revenge, he channels that profound aggression into starting a community advocacy group for safer roads.
What's fascinating here is the universality of this. Freud argued that every single human being relies on these defense mechanisms. They are necessary shock absorbers for life.
But you can't use them too much, right?
Right. He warned that there is a tipping point. If your ego becomes too reliant on distorting reality to avoid pain, you develop deeply neurotic behavior. You essentially lose your tether to the real world.
Okay, so if these defense mechanisms are how adults cope with internal warfare, it naturally begs the question, how did the ego get so battered in the first place? Like, why does one person's ego rely on regression while another person's ego relies on reaction formation?
Well, let me put my lecturer hat back on here. Freud believed the answer to adult neurosis was entirely mapped out in our childhood. Yes. This is where we encounter Freud's psychosexual stages of development. He boldly asserted that human personality is almost entirely crystallized during early childhood. He believed children pass through specific biological stages, and in each stage, the pleasure-seeking energy of the id focuses on a different area of the body, known as an erogenous zone.
And the mechanism that connects childhood to adult personality is called fixation, right? Freud argued that each stage comes with a specific psychological conflict. If a child's parents, either overindulge them or severely deprive them during that stage, the child's psychological development stalls. They become fixated. And that childhood fixation dictates their adult flaws.
Exactly. If we look at the progression, it starts with the oral stage, from birth to 1 year. The aid is focused on the mouth sucking, eating. The conflict is weaning. If a child is weaned too abruptly, Freud theorized they would grow into adults who compulsively smoke, overeat, or bite their nails whenever they feel anxious.
They're perpetually trying to satisfy that unresolved oral need. But then, from ages 1 to 3, you enter the anal stage. The erogenous zone shifts to bowel and bladder control, meaning the primary conflict is toilet training. This stage is fundamentally about mastering control over one's own body and environment.
And according to Freud, how parents handle toilet training shapes the child's entire relationship with authority and order. Harsh, punitive parenting creates an anal retentive adult, someone who is obsessively neat, stubborn, and desperately needs to control their environment.
And the opposite.
Conversely, overly lenient parenting creates an anal expulsive personality, someone who is chronically messy, disorganized, and reckless.
Which brings us to the most infamous part of the textbook, the phallic stage, ages 3 to 6. The erogenous zone shifts to the genitals, and children begin to recognize physical differences between sexes. This is where Freud introduces the Oedipus complex for boys.
Named after the Greek tragedy, yeah.
Right. He proposed that a young boy develops an unconscious sexual desire for his mother and views his father as a hated rival.
But the boy also feels his father's power. Freud called this castration anxiety, the profound fear that the father will physically punish the boy for these desires. To resolve this terrifying conflict, the boy's ego forces him to repress the desires and instead identify with his father.
So he internalizes the father's values.
Exactly, which is how Freud claimed the superego is fully formed.
And for girls, Freud initially proposed a parallel framework, which was the Electra complex, where a girl desires her father and resents her mother. Now, section 11.2 notes that the Electra complex was actually conceptualized by Freud's protege, Carl Jung.
Yeah, that's a common misconception that Freud came up with it.
Right. Freud initially agreed with it, later explicitly rejected it, but the broader psychoanalytic community kept it alive anyway. Freud also argued that girls experience penis envy during this stage, feeling a sense of biological deficit.
He theorized that if anyone, male or female, became fixated in this phallic stage, they would develop into adults who are excessively vain, aggressive, and overly ambitious.
Okay, lecturer, as a student trying to synthesize this in the 21st century, I have to raise my hand and push back here.
Please do.
Oedipus complexes, castration anxiety, penis envy. This sounds completely wild to modern ears. It sounds less like universal human biology and more like, well, the massive specific projection of one guy living in an incredibly repressed Victorian society.
That is exactly the pushback you should have, and it highlights the most important historical context in section 11.2. You cannot separate Freud's theories from turn of the 20th century Vienna. He lived in a culture where sexuality was aggressively suppressed.
Okay.
Because society refused to talk about sex, Freud assumed that all unexplained anxiety and neurosis must stem from that exact suppression.
He looked through the keyhole of his own culture and assumed he was seeing the entire world. Plus, as the textbook points out, he didn't actually observe young children to build these stages.
No, not at all.
He developed theories about toddlers by listening to the dreams and memories of wealthy, repressed adults sitting in his office, and then he worked backward to invent a universal biological timeline.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it explains why Freud's immediate followers, the Neo-Freudians, started branching off. They realized that human personality couldn't just be dictated by innate biological sexual drives. Culture, society, and peer relationships had to play a massive role.
But the textbook notes a really dark reason why that cultural exploration got stunted. As psychoanalysis was evolving, the geopolitical landscape in Europe basically collapsed.
Right.
World War II and the Nazi Holocaust occurred.
Exactly. Rampant anti-Semitism and the rise of fascism made it incredibly dangerous to focus on cultural or societal differences, especially for Jewish psychoanalysts. To protect themselves and their field, many mainstream analysts retreated inward.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. They stopped looking at how society shapes us, and instead rigidly focused on Freud's universal biological structures of the mind, the id, ego, and superego, because biological mechanics were politically neutral. It's a profound example of history directly altering the trajectory of a scientific discipline.
That is just incredible context. It really reframes why psychoanalysis dug its heels into these rigid biological stages.
It really does.
So after the phallic stage, Freud believed kids enter a latency period until puberty, where sexual urges go dormant and they focus on socializing. And finally, the genital stage of puberty, where those old urges resurface but are redirected toward socially acceptable partners.
That was his ultimate roadmap to a functioning adult. But as we look at his legacy today, modern psychology widely rejects the specifics. The psychosexual stages are not supported by modern empirical research. The concept of penis envy is dismissed. The idea that all dreams are disguised sexual wishes is largely abandoned.
So, what does this all mean? If modern science has dismantled so much of his specific work, why do we still dedicate entire textbook chapters to him? Why does he still matter to you and me?
Because while his specific answers were often wrong, the questions he asked fundamentally changed how humanity views itself. Before Freud, the mind was treated mostly as a conscious, rational machine. Freud forced the world to accept two massive truths. First, that our early childhood experiences leave permanent fingerprints on our adult personalities.
Right.
And second, that an enormous portion of our mental life, our fears, our biases, our motives, operates completely outside of our conscious awareness.
He gave us the vocabulary to understand our own irrationality.
Yeah.
So as you go through your day-to-day, maybe take a moment to look beneath the surface of your own iceberg. When you overreact to an email or snap at a friend, is that your rational ego talking? Or is your ease throwing a tantrum? Is your superego making you feel intensely guilty over something you shouldn't be carrying? Are you turning up the car radio to ignore a strange noise in your own life?
That is the ultimate application of this material. And I'll leave you with this final thought, building on those defense mechanisms we discussed. Freud cataloged how the mind distorts reality to protect itself from anxiety, but he lived in a world without the internet. So, what are our modern, unnamed defense mechanisms?
Oh, wow. That's really interesting.
Think about it. Is obsessive doom scrolling, 21st century form of avoidance, numbing the anxiety of a chaotic world by overwhelming the conscious mind with data? Is meticulously curating a flawless, hyper-filtered social media profile a modern adaptation of reaction formation? Projecting absolute perfection outward to mask a deep, unconscious terror of inadequacy.
We might be doing that right now.
We might be inventing entirely new defense mechanisms every single day that Freud never even had the vocabulary to name.
What a brilliant thought to end on. We've really just scratched the surface. But thank you, lecturer, for guiding us through the depths today. And thank you to you, listening right now, for joining us on this deep dive into section 11.2. Keep questioning your own invisible operating system. Keep looking for what's hidden underwater. And we'll see you next time.